Yo. All right, my name is Matthew Marinick. I am the president and CEO of Happy Feet Productions, and I am so glad that all of you guys can make it here today. I am looking forward to a great conversation about babies and their marginal value. Vivalag. So glad that all of you guys can make it here today. I am looking forward to a great conversation about babies and their marginal value. Test. Look at this, test. Fine, 1 second, Brian. You want to see if it's not blurry? 1 second. Mister, it's blurry. All right, let's see. Yeah, it's delayed by like 20 seconds. So, I mean, like, if I'm right here yapping and stuff, then we could just have this going like this, you know? Kind of fun to kind of have this going. It's not bad. And yeah, I'll see you on the other side. We can do this. We can test the delay right now as we're getting excited for this. Stopwatch. All right. I'm going to leave as it says 10 seconds on my phone here. I don't know if you actually can see that or not. All right. 10 seconds. I might walk away. I'm going to leave as it says 10 seconds on my phone here. I don't know if you actually can see that or not. All right. 10 seconds. I might walk away. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Dude, that's electric. All right. Why do you need your? Oh, you need to pay.
I need to pay, bro.
Okay.
Unless you want to pay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. All right. I'm glad you all could join us. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, who is a professor of economics at the Catholic University of Washington, D.C. Tonight she's going to be speaking on her book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Please welcome Dr. Pakaluk.
That was the most efficient introduction I've ever had. I realize I'm not wearing my mic, I'm sorry. And leave it to the econ students to be incredibly efficient. Is that working? No.
Yep.
Can you hear me okay? Sort of? Hi, Fred.
Hey.
How you doing? I didn't get a chance to say hi to all my friends before. I feel like this is kind of rude. All right. Well, there aren't enough words to say how delighted I am to be here, and I'm a little stunned at all the people filling in. Someone asked me earlier tonight if I had been on this campus before, and I think it was 2 years ago in the fall, but somebody might correct me and say it was 3. I wouldn't really be able to argue. So now I have a slight apology looking at all the great faces that are here. But it's an apology by way of, I'm going to assign blame. So I'm going to blame my hosts, Praxis, for asking me to give the version of these remarks, which are probably most appealing to the economics students. So to all those of you who are coming from somewhere else besides the economics department, you're just going to enjoy the ride. This is the spiciest version of this talk, that I have. So, but listen, stop me along the way. If I'm not clear, if I've gone too fast, stop me along the way. All right, I'm going to get right to it. So here's what I'm going to say tonight. I'm drawing extensively on my book, which has been recently heralded a cult classic by The New Yorker. My husband said, which cults? Maybe this is one of them. I am going to argue for a competing thesis about the decline of liberal democracy, which is in some quarters called the crisis of the West, and in some places the putative failure of liberalism. To set the stage, and I will get around to talking about my book, but my book is in some sense boring to me at this point, so I'll get there, don't worry. To set the stage, I want to call to mind 2 historic elections, all right? The first one is November of 2004. So many of you were still in diapers in 2004. I love diapers, by the way. That's not meant as a put down. I also love babies. All right, so this was the second Bush 43 election. And this was achieved by a razor-thin margin, if you know a little bit of political history. And pundits were, then as they were in 2016, like completely dazzled and confused that like the right side had lost the election. And so the New York Times columnist David Brooks drew attention to a little-known phenomenon that he dubbed the new red diaper babies. He highlighted the natalists, as he called them, that were found all around the country, defying falling birth rates, he said. And generally the retreat from marriage. The natalists, he called them, are having 3, 4, or more children. Like, oh my gosh. It's like, wow, 3. Their personal identity is defined by parenthood. They are more spiritually, emotionally, and physically invested in their homes, he said, than in any other sphere of life, having concluded that parenthood is the most personally enriching and elevating thing that they can do. So Brooks wasn't wrong about this. This was back in 2000. Anybody who's out in the hallway holding a baby, please don't be out there for my sake. If it's for yours, that's fine. All right. But there's room up here, baby on the ground. Brooks wasn't wrong about this. The men and women quietly defying the birth dearth, then as now, have strong reasons for what they're up to, right? These 3, 4, 5 children families that Brooks was talking about, they weren't like accidental families, people who didn't know how to use birth control. No, in fact, they're people with strong reasons I've called reasons of the heart. So just to give you a flavor of this, Amanda, who's a LDS mom that I talked to, she said to me, What do my kids mean to me? She said, everything. And nothing compares. I almost feel like this will hurt my friends who can't have children. Nothing is as good. So Amanda said of having her 5th baby, who was just 3 months old when we met her, it's so physical and it's the most hard thing you've ever done. And you can feel their body and smell them. And you look into their eyes and it's like another person. Well, fathers are so important, she said. But no human will have a better impact on this soul than I will as a mother. She said, so when I think about all the work, go out and speak or start a charitable foundation that helps people, which I want to do, she said, and I'm going to do that. But nothing I ever do will be as purposeful, more meaningful, or have more impact on a human than giving them a body and nurturing them as a human. And because of my religious beliefs, she said, I also know that this relationship is eternal. So for me, this is the most worthwhile thing I can do in this life. And she stopped and she said, is that making sense? I said, yes, it is. So these are the type of people Brooks was interested in 2004. And his interest in women like Amanda wasn't mere curiosity. He wanted to tell Americans, to draw attention to the fact that people getting married and having bigger than average families were associated with red America. They were Republican voters, statistically speaking. Brooks cited scholars who noted that Democrats had swept the largely childless cities, true blue locales like San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, Manhattan, which have the lowest percentages of children in the nation. But Democrats generally had poor showings in those places where families are settling down, notably the Sun Belt cities and outer suburbs of older metropolitan areas. So Brooks urged his readers to see the true motive forces behind the political divisions. The real fault lines of consequence, he argued, were familial. So just how real were these fault lines? So they were more real than Brooks knew in 2004. 2 years later, demographers based at the University of Michigan published findings about the red-blue voting patterns in 2000 and 2004. What they found was nothing short of remarkable. Marriage and birth rates, wait for it, correlated powerfully with voting. Places with high fertility and more marriage were vastly more likely to vote for Bush. The converse was also true, that low fertility locales favored non-Bush votes. The authors stated that the correlation found between in the United States between traditional families and the percentage of votes for Bush in both 2000 and 2004 was, to their knowledge, these scholars at University of Michigan, the highest spatial correlation between demographic and voting behavior on record. So the summary was that families were voting red and non-families were voting blue. So fast forward to the November of 2016 election, the Flight 93 election. So a gentleman by the name of Michael Anton, under the pseudonym Publius, in an influential essay dripping with contempt for never-Trump establishment conservatives, wrote, just what has conservatism achieved lately in the last 20 years? The answer, which appears to be nothing, might seem to lend credence to the plea that our ideas just haven't been tried, except that the same conservatives who generate those ideas are in charge of selling them to the broader public. If their ideas haven't been tried, who is ultimately at fault? Anton described Trumpism as a vote for life against death. Trump alone, among candidates for high office, in this or in the last 7 at least cycles, has stood up to say, I'm quoting Anton, has stood up to say, I want to live, I want my party to live, I want my country to live, I want my people to live. This, to Anton, meant broadly secure borders, I'm quoting, secure borders, economic nationalism, and America First foreign policy. The election of 2016, he said, would be a test of whether there is any virtue left in what used to be the core of the American nation. The election, he said, would be a struggle for life over death, charge the cockpit or die. Well, as you know, Trump won, shocking both the never-Trump establishment conservatives and the liberal elites of both parties. As in 2004, bewildered news media issued replete statements with hand-wringing and confusion, and Anton's pencil sketch of failure was swiftly filled out by a team of conservative academic counterinsurgents, elites in their own right, epitomized by the thesis, Why Liberalism Failed. A thesis contained in Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. For these petulant conservatives, Trump's election was nothing to celebrate. For sure, we narrowly avoided a pedal to the metal on the entire progressive left agenda of a Hillary presidency. Maybe we were safe for now. But Trump's election was an opportunity more than a victory, an opportunity to press for the full failure narrative. According to Anton and his follower counterinsurgents, it would be no more business as usual for conservative principles. Defined, if you want to know, again, I'm quoting, as the household gods of the reigning conservative think tanks, such as limited government, fiscal responsibility, low marginal tax rates, pro-business regulations, free trade abroad, and pro-life, pro-family legislation at home. No, old-fashioned conservative principles, at least those principles, would be bundled up and labeled for the failures that they were. Weak priorities at best, hypocritical at worst, covering, it was alleged, for a managerial class getting fat on the backs of ordinary Americans. Winning is what we want, Anton said, and if you haven't noticed, our side has been losing consistently since 1988. So the counterinsurgency, as I'm defining them, aims to take back conservative from zombie Reaganism, which was a failure. So Trump wasn't their guy, but he served a purpose. Deneen argued that Trump, while flawed, represented, I'm quoting from Why Liberalism Failed, today's widespread yearning for a strong leader, one with the will to take back popular control over liberalism's forms of bureaucratized government and globalized economy after decades of liberal dismantling of cultural norms and political habits essential to self-governance. They couldn't fit Trump into their new conservatism, so they settled for calling him a populist changemaker. In a nutshell, they argued, the 2016 election of Donald Trump represented a brand new political era, a mandate for regime change, and a fundamental realignment. Or maybe not. Meanwhile, hidden from the politics of hope and change, the University of Michigan demographers were at it again, and they continued their foray into the voting patterns. Family demographics, so marriage and the birth rates, at the state and county level were again the best predictor of red-blue voting patterns throughout the Obama years. They were able to show then that those patterns began to converge in the 1990s, with substantial correspondence after the year 2000, and continuing through the latest 2016 elections. More specifically, they wrote, after the turn of the century, correlations were observed between 0.8 and 0.9 for no less than 5 successive elections. These are whopping associations in statistical terms, even if you take into account that they are spatial correlations. You don't see spatial correlations that high very often. What this means for the leitmotifs of Anton's sketch, it's not entirely clear to me. At a minimum, whatever the fate of his conclusions about old-fashioned limited government conservative principles, it seems that Trump did represent a vote for life against death, because Trump was elected by voters actually alive and creating life against the living dead of the non-reproducing classes. The fault lines of consequence in 2016 had not become economics or nationalism, as the counterinsurgency hoped to prove. There was no realignment. Families still voted red, and non-families voted blue. What Michael Anton did not say, but nearly did, is that only a virile nation could charge the cockpit, a manly nation. Anton had said, a nation with virtue. Properly speaking, a nation of husbands, a nation of fathers. And fathers did just that. What the correlations mean is that traditional family formation, more marriage, less divorce, more children, less childlessness, is a vastly better predictor of voting patterns in America today, in my lifetime, than any other economic or cultural indicator available. And they looked at all the other stuff. The upshot of this is that we should not be so quick to agree that a story of decline brought the Trump 2026 vote. It may just as well be interpreted as a story of thriving, of optimistic family men and women who have hope for the future and believe in a future, and we know they believe because they got married and had children. They want to safeguard what we have for the future, so Trump's forward-looking optimism seemed appealing, as well as his promise to stand in the way of those trends which threaten the natural family. But such an attitude, if this is correct, wants nothing to do with regime change. In fact, it wants to conserve and advance the greatness of the land of liberty. Now, as an aside, if demographics are where the political action really is, then unprincipled immigration is absolutely something to cause a charge the cockpit or die situation. Some of the narrative of thriving voters can be laid on top of Anton's motifs. My point here is not that Anton was wrong about the election. My point is that he and the architects of the failure narrative misinterpreted the vital forces at play. This led them to run with a jumbled narrative, I would say. It's jumbled, about the nature and causes of decline, the decline of liberal democracy, and its likely sources of renewal. The failure narrative asserts that the cultural norms and habits, political habits of self-governance, were drained away by liberal principles present from the get-go in the American founding. Unbounded freedom, as the case is made, corrosive individualism, and agnosticism about common goods, so-called liberal neutrality. But the failure narrative failed to take into its view the fact of really existing families and communities and neighborhoods not in decline. What do they have in common? Is it a rejection of liberalism as Deneen defines it, or is it perhaps something else? The competing thesis, which I'd like to advance tonight, it's a competing thesis, and I'm the underdog in this fight, that's all right. The competing thesis about the failure of liberal democracy is drawn from the research for my book, and it is, I think, at once darker and more sinister, but perhaps gentler to the American experiment. So I argue that the norms, habits, and virtues of self-governance vital to the success of a free and democratic nation were not whittled away by liberal bureaucracies, but instead whittled away by the deliberate rejection of human reproduction, of marriage, and of marriage, since marriage just is that institution ordered to giving life. Giving rise to life is in fact the form and the basis for other self-governance, because it is an identifying act of free submission of the self to the other. So life-giving marriage is therefore the form and the basis of what we call ordered liberty. Life-giving marriage is the freedom for in the American project. So in short, my thesis is that ultimately smaller families and a retreat from marriage issued out the meager virtue of our time, and in turn the trouble with liberal democracy. So Hannah's story illustrates this well. So Hannah is the Hannah for whom the book is titled, as well as the biblical Hannah. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hannah's story. So Hannah, I interviewed Hannah and Esther together. They were best friends. They're the only two that I interviewed together. And so just to tell you that right off the bat, they were definitely Trump voters. In spite of, so they're super Jewish, in spite of living in an area of the Northeast that went overwhelmingly for Clinton in 2016. Esther's husband greeted us, Jewish beard and hair in all, his beard, his hair, with a bright red MAGA hat. He grinned at my arrival and he asked whether my study was to make fertility great again. Her best friend Hannah had her 12-month-old daughter with her during the interview, and Esther nursed her littlest one, her 9th child, during the interview. Esther grew up in a big family and always envisioned having kids, but Hannah didn't plan for this life. She said to me, I didn't even want to get married at one point in my life. I could not see myself married. I thought I would be like that medicine woman who doesn't get married. She laughed and continued, where I was in my early 20s, so pay attention, guys. In my early 20s, I was just doing my own thing for whatever I was doing at that point in my life. Most people in their academic years or in their professional careers are doing their own thing. And having children is not something that, if you're a level-headed person, in this world, you'd say, this doesn't fit into this lifestyle. You couldn't do this. It doesn't make sense. Because people think on rational levels, and I think maybe a little bit more super rational thinking has to infiltrate the masses, she said, to know that things are possible, like possibilities of expansion in your life. She was from a Reformed Jewish background where she didn't even want to get married at one point in her life. Hannah's search led her to the idea that children are the meaning of everything. We were searching, she said. Actually, she and her husband ended their search in Israel, and then they came back to the United States. They met this charismatic rabbi, but I don't explain that in what I'm about to say. She says, we were searching. My husband and I were searching. For us, we had both been around the block. We had both explored. We had dated in our public school secular life. We were both very clear and very focused that one of our main goals of getting married was to begin a family right away and to have a large family. That, she said, but also on a deeper level, in my own quest for meaning and purpose, I was very into the concept of infinity. I did a lot of Indian meditation and things like that, nirvana, kind of like this search for what's the meaning of things. And I feel like it all came down to this, the core of the answer was that children are this key to infinity. And especially being Jewish, she said, how much more so, because this is a link and a chain that we've had from Moses and from Abraham and from Noah and Adam. This link, continuing this legacy by having children, is a way to be part of this chain of infinity, she said. And to me, that was it. There is nothing else that is going to do that. It's true, such a conclusion might be reached in human terms, but Hannah's discernment was nourished by devotion to God after her conversion. She said, yes, it became something through my learning and my meditation and through my wanting to serve God as a Jewish woman, that having children is the answer. This is what I was being called to do as a servant of God. Hannah's contrast between two ways of life, her old self and her new self, provides the foundation for my counter thesis. My subjects, all of whom had 5 or more children, described their choice to have many children as a deliberate rejection of autonomous, customized, self-regarding lifestyle in favor of a way of life intentionally limited by the demands of motherhood. They were motivated by a deeply biblical worldview characterized by trust in God and hope in his providence. Like Hannah, my subjects groped around for descriptions of the life they had rejected, where the number and timing of children is kind of fitted into a narrative of self-identity. They thought of themselves as fitting into a greater narrative of childbearing. They spoke of self-sacrifice, but not of losing themselves. They believed they found themselves in having children, and that their personalities and capacities expanded, indeed so richly as to give rise to other persons. Like Hannah, the other women I met extended this contrast to their marriages, to their children, and to the social order more broadly. They believe that living with needy young children for an extended period of life fosters other regarding virtues necessary for egalitarianism and civic friendship, such as empathy, generosity, solidarity, and self-denial. Like Hannah, my subjects described a life of religious seriousness, we'll say, in which they allowed their beliefs about God and the meaning of life to shape their own hearts and desires. And finally, like Hannah, they had adopted a posture of openness to children as a way of life and not as a tiny season of life. Hannah's contrast between her old, in her words, self-regarding life and her new other-regarding one raised the issue of individualism. So, in her words, people doing their own thing. Recall that Tocqueville defined individualism as a mature and calm feeling which disposes each member of the community to sever himself from the mass of his fellows and draw apart with his family and friends. Tocqueville, like Hannah, also used the imagery of a chain. He argued that aristocratic societies with class and title had tied people together, with everyone playing a role in relation to all the other members of the community. Aristocracy, he said, had made a chain of all members of the community, from peasant to king. Democracy, he wrote, breaks the chain and severs all the links. Tocqueville worried that democratic orders necessarily initiate a degenerative shift toward corrosive individualism. For Tocqueville, individualism isn't the same as selfishness, which he called exaggerated love of self, but individualism proceeding more from erroneous judgment, like you just calmly decide you're doing your own thing, can give erroneous judgment can give rein to selfishness in the absence of some countervailing force, such as the aristocracy. But Hannah argued that the family also serves to link everybody like a chain. The family works against individualism by asserting a communitarian reality. In a single generation, an individual has parents and grandparents, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins, nieces, and nephews. These are the real flesh and blood human beings who make up society outside of your immediate family. You don't have to wonder if you care about your fellow man. You do care, because your fellow man might actually be your brother or your uncle or your son. I don't know if this is frequently true in Hillsdale, but it is definitely true where I live in Maryland. You have grandparents and children, adult children and grandchildren frequently living in the same set of blocks together. Moreover, across generations, individuals have ancestors to whom they have debts and offspring to whom they have responsibilities. Childbearing cancels debts, as it were, giving rise to new obligations. We would say paying it forward. Having children confers an eternal status on any one individual in the chain, making her equal in dignity to her kin for all time. Continuing the legacy by having children, Hannah said, is a way to be part of this chain of infinity. So the family is egalitarian, communitarian, and hierarchical, all in one. On this account, it's ties to family which redeem our freedom and direct it. The self-imposed duties of an abundant, generative family life provide the ballast against selfish forms of individualism. With strong, stable families, democracy in America might have a chance of fostering the private and public virtue that Tocqueville worried about. Hannah's familial chain is a perfect image of the paradox that she and my subjects described. A single link in the chain cannot do its own thing, but the link is never alone. She knows where she's been, she knows where she's going. She finds her purpose in the ties of the chain. Hannah said, everybody's searching for identity. Tattoo yourself, pierce yourself, take on a new religion, but everybody's got an ancestry. What a way to honor your legacy and your line. What a way to connect the past and the future. To me, that is part of being infinity, to continue a chain. So what a better way to form an identity, she said. She added, I have no regrets, not one. I mean, this life is way harder now than it was, but I have inner peace in my life that I didn't have. I was searching, but I'm not searching now. As my subjects described it, Hannah's chain wasn't a burial ground, but a seedbed. The moms that I interviewed likened having children, or likened families with many children, to a type of rich soil for the soul, in which those habits of right living, the virtues, were germinated. So Monica had a great story. I wasn't able to tell her whole story in the book, but she was a former, she said, promising young litigator who eventually walked away from law after a couple of kids. And she walked away when she realized that she thought her mom self was ruining her lawyer self. She was sort of fighting, these two selves were fighting, and she finally realized that that was terrible. Anyway, she said to me, I see a lot of kids. that don't have the qualities, the virtues that will serve them well as adults. They're badly formed young adults, because I think not just the small family, but the philosophy or the approach that comes with it and the focus on the wrong things, in particular material things, and selfish ambition and the training of young people to be very lost. They're lost in themselves in a way. They're overly focused on themselves because of the way they've been taught, which is that they are of the most importance. And they're oddly disconnected from others. They lack the ability to relate to others well, and also problem solving, critical thinking, self-sacrificing, all those wonderful virtues. And I just think, she stopped, I think that leads to either no marriage vocation or to a serious challenge if you do get married, because of those qualities of being able to serve others and to sacrifice for stuff, to work around problems, get through things together, to understand an individual person's different qualities and temperaments and work with it, and all those wonderful skills that are learned in a large family. Monica didn't blame John Locke or any other liberal baddie. In fact, not a single mom cited any political ideology, unless feminism counts as one. They were unsparing in their descriptions of a self-centered, individualistic America. But they didn't fault theories of rights or freedom or race or creed. Instead, they just blamed the way we grow up. Monica's observation reminded me of something that one of our older moms had told us. Donna had 8 children, and when I interviewed her, her children ranged from 28 down to 10. And she said this, she said, having children, even my first baby, opened my eyes to something I hope I can express well. Ever since then, if I see somebody who's handicapped, somebody with Down syndrome, somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who is poor, I think, well, that could be my baby. It makes it more immediate to me. That's somebody's baby. It could be my baby. You can't just dismiss somebody or try not to think about them or marginalize them in a way, because you realize, well, if you're open to life, you could really have a child with this or that condition. The logic of Donna's realization, that could be my baby, could also be extended to her children. That could be my brother or sister. Maggie, a Catholic mom of 6, made this explicit. She told us, one of the things our parish priest said, or pointed out to me one day, we were picking up kids from school, and my oldest son grabbed the baby and was just walking around with the baby, and our priest said, look at that, look at him. That's what we want around here. Big brothers knowing how to carry a baby and be proud of introducing his younger sister to his friends. And for me, she said, it wasn't a big deal. He carries the baby all the time. He changes her diapers. He puts her down for a nap. That's just a way of life. But from that priest's perspective, he doesn't see a lot of big families or a lot of big brothers kind of loving on their little sister. And for him, it was a kind of moment, which I thought was interesting. Maggie believed that carrying the baby isn't anything special. So actually, there's a picture of a child carrying a child on the front cover of my book. That's very intentional. She believed that this wasn't a big deal. It was a way of life for her son, and it was picked up from daily living. And it would shape the man that he would become. Maggie's story recalled to me that iconic photo, which maybe you've seen, and the caption from Father Flanagan's Home for Orphans in Nebraska called Boys Town. As the story goes, in 1918, a little boy named Howard was abandoned at Boys Town. Polio had left him crippled, wearing leg braces. Older boys at the home, right, these are all boys and they're all orphans, older boys at the home began carrying Howard around. In 1921, a well-known Omaha photographer named Louis Bostwick captured this common sight. Little Howard, he had a big hat on, I have a picture of it, big hat, and he's grinning. He's got this big grin on his face, and he's sitting on the back of a bigger boy named Reuben. And to this photo, later Father Flanagan fixed the phrase that became the unofficial motto of Boys Town. He ain't heavy, Father, he's my brother. Of course, Howard wasn't the boy's biological brother. He was an unwanted orphan with warped legs. But in helping Howard, those young men found out the meaning of their strength. And the bond between strong and weak took on a brotherly character in which the strong received more than they gave. In the business of diagnosing what ails America, it's easy enough to name the symptoms: egoism, individualism, separation, loneliness, division, alienation, anxiety. Major books written on all of these topics in the last 10 years. People doing their own thing. Perhaps the way to sum it up is the lack of a brother, someone you put before you, someone you carry. That doesn't necessarily have to be a biological brother. It could be a brother like Howard had a brother. But the most natural school of brotherhood is a brother, if you're a boy. It's a sister, if you're a girl. Notably, to have at least 2 boys and 2 girls in a family, you're going to have about 5 or 6 kids. 4 plus extras in case you get more of one or the other. It's true. It took me 7 to get 2 of each. So that wasn't the point. But an unintended consequence, and follow the argument here. This is about unintended consequences. An unintended consequence of having a large family is that your children of both sexes are vastly more likely to have at least one human being of their own sex that they can call brother or sister. The testimonies in this volume suggest that a lack of fraternity and sorority, the state of growing up without a brother or a sister like you, matters more for the character of the nation than the ideas left to us in dusty books. I'm not against dusty books. I mean, I can't be, and I mean, here, I feel like it's almost wrong to say, to say anything pejorative about dusty books. I love dusty books. But there isn't even a word in our language. We have a word for having no parents. There is not a word in our language for not having a brother or a sister like you. The phenomenon that we heard across the sample was roughly the same. Someone more needy needs you, like little Howard. There's no way out. You have to meet those needs because you brought them into existence. So grudgingly or not, you rise to the occasion. It looks like the giving is on your side, but you figure out that you're the receiver after all, because you discover your purpose, the meaning of your strengths, your identity, like Hannah. And it wasn't just the kids who matured by having the babies around, it was the moms and the dads. They had to become grown-ups for their kids, and if they succeeded, they became more attractive to their spouses. They became better workers, better neighbors, better sons and daughters of God. If the women in my study believe, and they did, that the Lord repays them for their gift of self, they believe that virtue is one of the rewards that spills over to their marriages, to their communities, and to the nation. On their account, virtue wasn't victim to freedom. It was victim to the principled sterilization of our families. Principled because it was chosen for its own sake. It didn't fly under the flag of liberal value neutrality. I don't have time today to walk you through the sad saga of about 100 years of us becoming largely convinced that smaller family sizes were a positive good. But my subjects believed, we wrongly came to believe, that smaller family sizes are a positive good for better marriages, right? You need to wait and have your time before you start your family and have your first kid. You hear this all the time. Really wonderful people say that all the time. We really believe that smaller family sizes are better for marriage. But for what else? For responsible parenting? That's one of my favorite ones. For a productive economy, Janet Yellen. And a more fulfilled adulthood. So a woman named Eileen in Los Angeles said, challengingly, it's hard for me to understand family life as being as good with an intentionally chosen smaller family. And she said, this is so not acceptable to say, but there is a selfishness there that you're not going to burn out of yourself. And to have a society that is not only not growing in the virtues that a large family demands, but also not doing it as a point of principle. So it's not even accidental, she said, like we just fell into this. It's almost like it's become a cultural principle, either because of environmentalism, or because it's just not as valued to nurture a big family. So that shift, she says, almost more alarming, the principal change of what the nature of the human being is and what it is to love. So to sum up, that smaller families were better for us, they said, was just false. It was a mirage. It looks like the real deal, but only on the surface. Deep down, it's not fulfilling. Or worse, it prematurely fulfills the part of us meant to grow up, and it keeps us in a kind of perpetual adolescence. The litigator Monica trying to keep her mom self from ruining her lawyer self. The country got on the wrong track, my subjects believe, when it bought into a neo-Malthusian paradigm that more people could ever be a problem for a marriage, for a family, for an economy, or a nation. It got on the wrong track when a type of overly planned parenthood, bookended by deliberate sterility. Okay, let me just make this entirely clear. You get married, you stay sterile for as long as you can, you have your kids, and then you're sterile again. That's what our conception of marriage is today. So bookended by deliberate sterility became the norm for marriage. No longer did we pray like the biblical Hannah to be set free from our barrenness. Instead, we applied our cleverest technologies to give impotence the rein. Holding her newborn, Esther said serenely, "You know, my understanding is all blessings come from God. And the three big blessings that we talk about in Judaism are children who bring us pride and joy and follow in tradition, and good health and financial sustenance. I don't feel like you could ever have too much of any of those things. These are blessings. They're God's expression of goodness. We can put up roadblocks to not get the blessings, but those are the blessings." And she said, "Sometimes we need to ask God to make ourselves proper vessels to receive the blessings, but those are the biggest blessings." So to conclude, for all of his insight, David Brooks surely got one thing wrong in his 2004 column. He argued that the differences between natalists and people on the other side of the cultural or political divide, he said, are differences of degree, not of kind. So Brooks is always arguing that there's not really any big difference between anybody, like we should all just get along. I like the idea, but that can't be right. People who think you can't have too many children are obviously different in kind. Right? It's not a small difference. It's the kind of difference that rejects, at a minimum, abortion and euthanasia. It asserts that the child is lovable and wantable. Economic logic be damned. Because the image of God is in every child. And moreover, God took flesh as an infant, not just as a man. People who think you can't have too many children will organize their lives around the ability to receive the blessing of children, from earlier marriages to careers planned around children and not the other way around. That difference will tend to go along with a culture of hospitality, of welcoming the stranger, whether the stranger is in the womb or a Sunday visitor. People who think you can't have too many children will prioritize the needs of children in policy and politics and not the needs and wants of adults. It's the kind of difference that rejects the very idea of responsible parenthood, as if too many children would be irresponsible in a marriage. People who believe you can't have too many children will tend to assert that God may be trusted to provide for the children he sends. Correspondingly, it's the kind of difference that sees a growing market economy as fundamentally good and not exploitative, suspect, or requiring special justification. Fathers have a sacred duty to provide for their children, and in what other way does God intend for that to happen than by hard work and reasonable expectation of economic growth? People who think you can't have too many children will tend to treasure thrift and wise spending in a nation, because what is good for a household is good for a nation. And people who believe you can't have too many children will tend to favor smaller government because they will understand more intuitively that the family is the first society prior to the state, the society of a man and his wife and his children. Thus, the state cannot give too much assistance without tending to undermine the natural authority and responsibility of the father. People who believe you can't have too many children will tend to prize liberty for the sake of family responsibility, the invitation to do and to be everything for the dependent spouses, children, and family in their lives, and to take our turn as dependents in the cycle of life. Do you know that great piece, I want to be a burden on my family? Freedom for dependence, not from dependence. In sum, believing you can't have too many children gives rise to a very particular set of principles, oddly similar to the ones embraced by the brand of conservatism that didn't produce any winning since 1988. These principles aren't wrong, and they never were wrong, but they are the reason that conservatives are now divided. Probe a little deeper, and you will find that families still believe in these putatively conservative liberal principles. Non-families don't, because non-families look to the power of the state to provide the securities that families are meant to provide. And if you don't believe me, pay attention to the realigned conservatives calling economic growth into question and rejecting as naive the optimism of market economies. Look into the attitude of realigned conservatives towards family size. Is there any truth more hard-won than this one? That a nation committed to redistributing benefits cannot be committed to open family sizes any more than it could be committed to open borders. Which leads me to say that if Brooks got one thing wrong, Anton and Deneen got at least one important thing right. We are divided in a deep way. There is a struggle between two ways of life. We may, in fact, be in a charge the cockpit or die situation. But the enemy isn't, I submit, liberalism as they've defined it, nor the liberal elites, nor the managerial class, not the obviously problematic hordes of immigrants or global trade, and not even childless cat ladies. And I'm not here to defend any of these things. The enemy may, in fact, be a desire not to live, right? So Anton said, I want to live, not to live, that resides first and foremost in the human heart, an unwillingness to accept natural fecundity. This is a kind of sickness that replaces a divine wisdom, be fruitful and multiply, with a merely human wisdom. Planned Parenthood, a path that leads inexorably to, if I'm right, a lack of self-governance, first in sexual matters, then in failed marriages, then in a failed path to marriage, then indeed in civic life. For those habituated to putting self over others will inevitably put self over others. And finally, in the next generation, children who lack the virtues of an abundant family life, and who in turn put off marriage and childbearing even further. Perhaps what ails us is not our freedom per se, but something we mistake for freedom, which is being detached from family obligations, which are actually the demands that save us from egoism and despair. We're like loose links jumbled together in a scrap heap. It's not liberty exactly that we have too much of. It's disintegration. And you can't solve a problem of disintegration by turning freedom into the enemy. You have to figure out where integration comes from. So Hannah Arendt wrote in 1958, only the full experience of natality can bestow upon human affairs faith and hope, those two essential characteristics of human existence. Natality is where integration comes from embracing the call to be linked up forever in the family chain. Today, as it ever was, it is Abrahamic faith that provides the motive and the spiritual resources for childbearing. Arendt continued, it is in this faith, or is this faith in and hope for the world that found its most glorious and most succinct expression in the few words with which the Gospels announce their glad tidings. A child has been born unto us. So I figure that liberalism really failed because the people who inhabit liberal orders are no longer integrated human beings. They didn't become disintegrated by accident. It was a specific set of ideas and choices that we can name and discuss, debate, adjudicate. My work aims to bring these ideas and choices to light in service of a real understanding of our time and perhaps a credible path to renewal. right? Like if it's the ghost of John Locke, it's just over, right? Because like that's it, forever and one and done, right? We don't need to wait for regime change. If we love our country, we can keep our country. What we can't keep is the lie that childbearing and virtue can be had or restored on secular terms. They can't. But with abundant families nourished by strong churches, which was pretty much Tocqueville's recommendation, democracy in America might still have a chance. Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I really like this. I have a question. It's not clear to me from what you said. You said 100 years of selling the idea that smaller family size is a positive good. But what do you think? Can you, in a nutshell, say what happened? I've got my own ideas.
In a nutshell?
On this.
Well, in my book, I trace out a line from Malthus to Keynes, with a bunch of other unsavory characters in between, and of course, it turns into activism in the 20th century. Leads right down the line. Of course, without saying so, Planned Parenthood I think is part of this. But I've come to, what I didn't discuss was kind of my economic theory, which is here, and I maybe would have been more interesting too. but I've so I think this is Malthusian in the modern era, but I actually think that I tend to doubt whether children were always valued for their own sakes. So if you think about, lots of phases of history, you can find all kinds of times when, right, the Gnostics didn't really think we should have kids, and the Romans exposed weak kids. I think by and large, people have had kids for the sake of other things that they would like to have. So put it briefly, like you have kids because you need them or you want them. And I think more or less today there are no economic needs for having children. Like those are all gone. So the people having kids today are people who figured out that children are intrinsically valuable. But I don't have, besides the particular history, which I think is essentially like the standard short-term economic thinking, right? Which is.
So how is it sold to people? I guess is what I really want to know. Why was it?
Oh, it's sold to people. I think.
How did it become something that so many adopt?
Well, the association of larger families with poverty, which I think is still prevalent. Not just larger families, but immigration. All just basically the general ideas. If you put more people in this place, there will be fewer things per capita, right? But it's the first stage. So, but I'd like to know your theory. I don't know. Yeah, good. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I love the inside view
Yeah.
that you give of a way of life that I think is apparent but still kind of hidden in the culture.
Yeah.
So it's really so much great in your book and in the talk. The view that you're illustrating is beautiful, attractive, integrated, informed by faith. But do you think there are versions of natalism that come from various sectors of our elite society that are very problematic? And how would you distinguish them from what you are talking about? And I'm thinking of Elon Musk. I'm thinking of the short clip that we just watched. I don't know if you watched it on the Wall Street Journal. Absolutely terrifying clip of a couple and why they're having children and think eugenics would be helpful for this enterprise, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking of certain strains of feminism where motherhood becomes all. How would you distinguish these from what you are defending?
Yeah, thanks. That's a big question. So I'm making friends with nobody except you guys. I just got a call from an NPR reporter today who said She said, well, like your book has been talked about by a lot of conservative intellectuals, but do you agree with all the conservative intellectuals that we should try to convince people to have kids? And I said, well, I mean, I was like, page 463, like, no, I don't. Obviously, like, I don't. But I mean, what I mean is the state shouldn't try to convince you to have children. So yeah, I don't believe that the sort of state-sponsored natalism is either, it's not feasible, first of all, in the sense, well, and for 45 years we haven't managed it. It hasn't been tried here for 45 years, but it's been tried all over the world for 45 years, and it hasn't been successful. The state sure as heck can be very successful preventing births. So here's the problem I have. Like, I don't think it's feasible to promote births from the state. If you want to ask me about specific examples, we could talk about that. But the other thing is, I don't think it's ethical, because I don't see how you admit that states can encourage births directly without also admitting that it's a proper function of government to discourage births. And we are definitely not in a world in which most human beings are persuaded we need more children. Even though, I mean, the demographic writing is on the wall, but every day I get hate mail from people who say, you're a monster because the world is overpopulated and we're about to go under. I'm like, okay, well, you're running with very outdated information, sir, but thanks for writing. Yeah, so like, I just don't think this is the proper function of government. I think it's illegitimate. And I'm not quite convinced that the conservative elites in my town are going to be able to explain to me why the state can target a higher birth rate but not a lower one. I just don't see it. So that was one part of your question. I don't know which clip you watched, like these secular pronatalists. An interesting question is how many of them there are. I don't think there are very many. They're very odd, and they make some hay, and people like to watch them, but I don't think there are very many of them. But interestingly, to know exactly how many of them there are, you'd have to do a representative sample of people with large numbers of children. Nobody's done that. Amazing, right? No one's done that. So at the moment, the Collinses, and I don't know if they were in the clip, okay, I was just going to say, there's only one couple I know that are famous, like secular, like pronatalist couple, and they're really appalling. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, they're super appalling. I mean, they're like, oh, and we like beat our children because they're like animals, and you're like, okay, yeah, they're really appalling. But I think that they just, they're like the train wreck. They're just, but listen, like, it was apparent to somebody looking at these trends 10 years ago that like the world is about to get very bossy about people having children. Right, so we've seen Hungary for the last 10, 12 years get very bossy about having children. And so we need an explanation. Like, what is it that drives people to have children? This is what the point here is. I mean, like, it's nice to have a window into a world nobody's seen before. And thankfully, so far, most of the reaction's been positive. Although I'll tell you, the more people that read it, the more the creeps are going to come out of the woodwork. They'll call it all kinds of things. But in a sense, I want to stand in the breach and say, I'm actually in agreement with the liberal feminists. I don't think states should be bossy about having kids. I think it's a sacred space. Now, the state should be thinking about the climate in which births can be encouraged in the best possible way. So for me, what is that? Well, that's religious freedom. And so then people say, well, we've got religious freedom in this country, and still no one's having kids. And I say, well, do you think we have religious freedom? What are the things churches are supposed to do? And they say, have church on Sunday. And you go, yeah, no, that's not actually all what churches are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be tending to all the corporal and spiritual needs. So we have a situation in which a state monopoly takes care of all of the spiritual and corporal needs of people. The state educates, the state takes care of your health care, the state takes care of your old age benefits, the state does everything which is functionally the job of the church. So there is no religious freedom in this country. There's freedom of worship on Sunday. That's what we have. So if you really want to know what it would look like not to have the state competing with the church, you'd have to think about something like the United States in 1830. Well, the birth rate was a lot higher then. In any case, that's a longer, sort of speculative conversation. But I'm deeply concerned about this. It's coming. Nobody has any idea what is about to happen. The demographic cliff we're about to sail over.
Roy Wilcox, or maybe it's Tim Carney in his book, you're probably familiar with both of those books.
Yeah.
They're both really good, and it's kind of interesting how all 3 of your books came out this year.
Yeah, unplanned. It was emergent order.
Yeah, they're really a triple fire.
Yeah.
They're really great in their own way. Carney identifies these 4 demographics that do have higher fertility rates. I'm trying to remember.
Wilcox.
Oh, is it Wilcox who does that? Okay. Asian Americans. And
Conservatives, Christians, Asian Americans, and liberal strivers who are college
the
educated.
strivers, yeah, the strivers. So it seems as though there are some pockets where fertility rates can be supported in a non-religious environment for other reasons. And I wonder if you could comment on that, because you're really highlighting the necessity for a religious framework to do this.
Yeah.
Is that really the case?
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, I have my disagreements. I mean, look, if what you want to do is like find other ways to describe people who have religious motives, you can do that. You could call them conservatives. There's a tremendously large overlap between conservative and religion. So I just set that one aside. Like Asian Americans, okay, right. What you're largely looking at is like a hair's breadth of a higher fertility, which is mostly driven by earlier marriage. You also have to abstract from the generational impact. I mean, most immigrants converge to native-born birth rates in a generation. Most of his discussion of Asian Americans focuses on marriage. Religious Americans, liberal elites with college degrees, they do marriage better, but they don't have more children. Births fall with every successive degree that you have, women. So if you want to have families, drop out of college now. Yeah, so no, I mean, like I said, if you really wanted to figure out whether there was a substantial number of like secular, now listen, do they exist at all? Of course they do. I get emails from them too. They're like, hey, interview me next. I'm like, you got it, okay. They're out there, but are they, and I did my best. I gave you the one case of the most secular person I interviewed because it helps to show the point, which is that people don't do this by accident. They do it because they've come to believe it's good and worth doing. 98% of the time for religious reasons, but like the 2% might be something else. So, but I would really like to have a number on that.
Well, doesn't Mary Eberstadt argue that it's maybe a reverse causal relation where you see the birth rates go down and then religion starts to diminish rather than the relation the other way?
Yeah, well, I think that's, I mean, certainly that would be part of, I agree with her thesis, that'd be part of my thesis as well, right? The types of virtues that I say are downstream from growing up with a large family are also the kinds of virtues which would make you more, more likely to find meaning in a religious community, so for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you again, Dr.
You're welcome.